Hey everyone, this is Chris Grosso with the Healing Journey web series presented by Toivo by Advocacy Unlimited. And my very special guest today is the one and only Mr. Noah Levine. Noah, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Thanks. So I want to read your bio really quick before we dive into this conversation to give anyone who's not familiar with you a little background. So Noah Levine, author of Dharma Punk's Against the Stream, The Heart of the Revolution, and Refuge Recovery, is a Buddhist teacher, author, and counselor. He has created a Buddhist approach to addiction recovery called Refuge Recovery that includes peer-led meetings as well as a professional treatment center. He is also the founding teacher of Against the Stream Buddhist Meditation Society, with centers in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Nashville, and over 20 affiliated groups around North America. He teaches meditation classes, workshops, and retreats internationally. Noah holds a master's degree in counseling psychology and lives in Los Angeles. You're a busy man, my friend. Lots going on.
All of that is true.
Yes. And thank you for taking the time. We were just chatting before we started. Noah and I are friends on Facebook. He's been doing all these Wanderlust events and hanging out with MC Yogi, throwing t-shirts into the crowd and running 5Ks and all sorts of good stuff, man. It's exciting.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Cool. Well, so thanks for taking the time to do this today. I'm excited to talk to you about refuge recovery, which is something I've become very passionate about in recent years. So really quick, though, before we jump into that, to give some context and some background for anyone who may not be familiar with you or possibly hasn't read Dharma Punks, for example, can you talk a little bit about what brought you to the Buddhist path? It's obvious, you're in recovery, so maybe you could talk a little bit about your younger years and addiction. And I know there was crime elements and all sorts of goodness there. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. Um, my sense is that I was born into an environment that was a pretty good setup for a lot of suffering and also being introduced to the Dharma. So my father, Stephen Levine, many people are familiar with his work, and by the time I was born, he was a meditation teacher and an author, and my parents were divorced when I was very young. My mother was struggling with her own addiction. My father had a history of addiction, although he had been really in the kind of Dharma solution for a long time by the time I was born. So, my early childhood was tumultuous and painful, and I was feeling suicidal by the time I was 5 years old,
Yeah.
and really, with a sense of reincarnation, with a sense of I could kill myself and start over. This is painful and scary enough that I would actually like to get out. And what happened for me was that suicidal ideation turned towards the drugs and alcohol. And when I started getting high at 7 years old, and when I started drinking and smoke, and doing cocaine, and when I found drugs at a very young age, I was eating LSD. When I was 10, I was eating mushrooms. By the time I was 12, I was doing cocaine, so it was just like really fast and furious adolescent drug use. And for a long time, it was a solution and it was fun. And I heard punk rock when I was 10 years old in 1981. And I heard the Pistols and I heard Black Flag and I heard all of these bands that were screaming about injustice and inequality and ignorance and, this sort of anarchist rejection of the status quo. Right. And so that punk rock music just kind of gave me meaning and hope. And the drugs took the edge off of the personal pain I was in. But as happens for all drug addicts eventually, it went from solution to addiction and went from alleviating pain to creating suffering. And I started getting sent to 12-step meetings when I was like 13 years old because I was getting arrested a lot, and they, to go get my court card signed. And I don't remember that much from the 12-step meetings early on, other than they were talking about God and they were adults. Yeah. And I wasn't ready. but by the time I was 17 years old and I was really strung out on crack and I had started to inject drugs and was mostly on the streets and in and out of juvenile hall over and over, that the willingness, right, the desperation, the pain, my third felony arrest scared me enough to be, to kind of give me a wake up call. Now, that wake up call came in the form of taking responsibility for my own actions and realizing that up to then I'd blamed society, system, police. I used to love to blame the hippies. It was my parents' hippie spirituality that I was rejecting, and but there was that moment of, oh, actually, I got myself into this mess, and with that came a ton of shame for the actions, but also a little bit of hope. If I got myself into this situation, maybe I can get myself out. Mm. And in that same time period, my father said, I was telling him about what was happening for me, and he said, would you like to try meditation? And I was willing, right? There was that moment of willingness, and I said, I'll try anything. I'm desperate. Yeah. So I started meditating in juvenile hall in 1988. And I had a subtle but powerful shift. As we all know, meditation doesn't kind of work instantly. But I did get a glimpse for the first time in my life that through mindfulness, present time awareness, coming back into the body and out of my head, that I could ignore my head, that I didn't have to obey my mind that was saying drink, fight, steal, lie, cheat, my mind, which had such bad advice for me, I could actually bring the attention out of that and into the breath, body, present time experience, mindfulness. So that was really the kind of turning point for me. Was I started meditating and I saw through direct experience, this is practical, this is useful. And I started doing 12-step stuff and said, I know I'm an addict and I know I need to stop using. And I was locked up for about 9 months in the juvie and then in a group home. And I found in the 12-step rooms community. I found fellowship, what we call in Buddhism, Sangha. People like me, some people that I had known that had gotten sober. And so I felt appreciating of the 12-step rooms and the program, but the philosophy didn't fit for me. It was too theistic. It was too Judeo-Christian. So for me, as an atheist, anarchist, I was just like, I couldn't really buy into this thinly veiled Christianity or thinly veiled, open-minded theism, right? God will remove your shortcomings. God make the decision to turn it over to your higher power. And I liked the people, and I even got a sense of spiritual solution. I got a sense of spiritual solution, but their approach to spirituality, the theistic, outside of yourself, disempowering theism, in my mind, didn't resonate so much. But in Buddhism, I found a practice that felt very empowering, that allowed me to take full responsibility for my happiness, for my recovery, for my forgiveness, not waiting for it to be magically removed by some external force. So I really landed solidly in Buddhism as a philosophy and as a practice, but the Buddhist community wasn't so interesting to me. It was a bunch of old hippies, and I was a young punk rocker. But in the 12-step rooms, there was a bunch of young punks and alternatives people, and so I found my community over here in 12-step rooms and my philosophy over here in Buddhist Sanghas. And it kind of played out like that for a long time until I eventually created Dharma Punks and Against the Stream and now Refuge Recovery.
Yeah. That's an incredible story, man. I was turned on to Dharma Punks, I don't know, back in like 2004, 2005. Tracy from Connecticut, who was a student of yours, she had started up the Elm City Dharma Collective, and Pablo Das would come out a lot, and that was great, man. It's actually the first time I saw you. You came out and spoke there too one evening, and Vinny was with you, and It was good. I brought my brother, who he's not really interested in spirituality or Buddhism, but he could even dig it. You know, the way you approach it. So people that the younger punk rockers, and not just punk rockers, but the younger kids, it's something that's relatable to, and I love that about your offering, and also with Refuge Recovery. I really dig the way that you approach recovery, and we're going to jump into that in a second.
Yeah.
One thing I like about that, that I wanted to talk about before we get into the specifics of the book and the approach, is that it was a community effort for you creating this. You actually write in the foreword something to the effect of that even though the book is credited to you as the author, there was many people and many things that had to come together in order to make it happen. So again, before we jump into the specifics of Refuge Recovery, can you talk about the process of putting it all together?
Yeah. Um, I think like maybe it's probably about 8 years ago now,
Yeah.
something like that. Maybe 10 years ago, we created the Buddhist Recovery Network. And Kevin Griffin and myself, and we sort of developed this nonprofit for Buddhist Recovery Network. And then we had the first conference, first and only Buddhist Recovery Network conference at my meditation center in Los Angeles. And at that conference, I proposed, let's stop looking at the 12 steps and let's just look at Buddhism. Because Kevin and most of the other people were still interested in offering Buddhist perspectives on the 12 steps. And I was one of the voices that said, we don't need to keep translating this through a Judeo-Christian lens. We can just bring a Buddhist lens to this perspective. And so at that conference 8 years ago, I said, here's the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. Here's core Buddhism and how it applies to addiction, recovery, treatment. And so it was my first proposal. And I put it out there and I just did a rough draft of it. And then in that conference, we had a big discussion and I took feedback on, different people's perspectives of, how it fits and what's missing. And then over a period of about 5 years after that, there was a group from our Sangha in Los Angeles that included Dave Smith and George Haas and some Dharma teachers that are in long-term recovery, Shannon Fowler and Andrea Davis. And so there's a big group of us, Mary Stankiewicz. And we would get together regularly and say, okay, what needs to be edited here? How's the language? We made the format for the meetings. The format for the meetings kept changing. We kept saying well, let's try this. And in the beginning, there was a big thing for me of how are we going to make this reproducible without needing a meditation teacher in every meeting? How is this going to be a peer-led group? Because Buddhism is so hierarchical, and there has to be an empowered Dharma teacher. So how are we going to offer Buddhism for addicts without empowered Dharma teachers in each group? And that was when we as a group, came up with hey, what if we have a script of meditation instructions that say, read this line, pause, read this instruction, do 2 minutes of silence. And so that anyone could take the sheet, the script, and lead the whole group in meditation. So that was one of the things that came out of this group effort. So it was a really kind of back and forth, and I would take the notes, and then I'd go back and edit the manuscript, and then I'd bring it back, and I'd take the notes, and I'd go back, because somebody has to sit down and write it. But I really wanted it to be a group effort of us doing it. And so I actually wrote it in the plural, in the we of Refuge Recovery. And the truth is, Chris, I would have liked to have published the book anonymously and to not have my name on it at all. I would have liked to have just put it out there without me being the person, as they did in Alcoholics Anonymous, 80 years ago. My publisher wouldn't publish it if I didn't put my name on it.
Yeah.
And, and then there was a lot of encouragement to me. Of course, we could have self-published it, but there was a lot of people who said, Noah, you have a platform. You've already written 3 books. You have a large community, and you're known as a recovery Buddhist person. If you put your name on it, you'll help it spread. If you don't put your name on it, it'll take a really long time, and a lot of people won't actually hear about it because you won't get publicity, you won't get press, you won't get podcasts. There'll be nobody to go on the Chris Grosso show
Yes.
if you don't put your name on it. So I was a little bit hesitant, but said, okay, this makes sense. I'm willing to be the spokesperson, founder, mouthpiece for Buddhist recovery because I feel so passionate about it, because I feel so strongly that this is a huge missing piece in the recovery world that tends to be so theistic when it comes to spirituality, and to say actually there's this whole spiritual practice that is completely non-theistic. We don't talk about God at all.
Right.
We talk about compassion. We talk about presence.
It's a great program, and thank you for sharing that backstory. I think that's very important. It's not something that just popped up overnight. You've put a lot of time and effort into this, and many other people together, and it shows in the book, and it shows in the meetings, many of which I've attended. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about the refuge recovery process. In the book, you write that refuge recovery is a practice, a process, a set of tools, a treatment, and a path to healing addiction and the suffering caused by addiction. So let's talk about that. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Well, because we're basing it on Buddhism, and of course, the 12 steps, which I've been a part of for 28 years, where it's this linear, do step one, do step two, and here's a map to how to recover from addiction. And Buddhism offers the same thing. Here's a map of how to recover from whatever is causing you suffering. So when I said, okay, let's do this, like I've already said, the Four Noble Truths are a treatment process for all forms of suffering. That are, there's the teaching that through following the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, you can eliminate suffering in your life of all kinds, including and especially the suffering that addiction causes in our life. So the first truth of refuge recovery is the first noble truth of Buddhism, which is that there is suffering in life. And in refuge, we say addiction of any form, any manifestation, whether it's substances or behaviors, or even loving an addict, that sort of Al-Anon family of addict, that this is suffering. There is suffering in addiction. And then we have to break our denial, our minimalization, the way that we rationalize it, and turn towards the suffering and see it clearly. And then we can begin to go to the second. And so there's as you know, there's a big inventory in that first truth of, I think there's 25 questions or something like that of, how has suffering manifested in your life? Then the second truth, which is the cause of all human suffering, is repetitive craving that manifests as clinging, manifests as aversion, manifests as all forms of self-centeredness, this repetitive craving. And so then again, there's another inventory that says, let's look at, now everyone has craving. It's our survival instinct. Everyone has it. But what sets the addict apart from the non-addict? The non-addict also wants life to be pleasant and not unpleasant. And so there's a big inventory of let's look at, is there trauma? Was there abuse? Was there betrayal? Is there a history of addiction in the family? Is there, personal things underneath that were fueling the thirst, the craving? Because the core cause of addiction is the repetitive craving.
Right.
And so it's starting to look at what was fueling that in us. And then we can get to the third truth, which is recovery is possible, actually. We can be free from craving. We can be free from the suffering that addiction creates in our lives. And part of doing that is committing to our practice, committing to an ethical way of being in the world, committing to service and forgiving ourselves and forgiving others. So that commitment, that effort that's asked for, we talk about taking refuge in your own recovery, taking refuge in the practices that will lead to your recovery, and taking refuge in the community. So, there's some popular views in current addiction treatment. One is like the Gabor idea that all addiction comes from trauma. So that's part of what we're looking at in the second noble truth. I wouldn't be so black and white about it myself. I wouldn't say all of the time, but it's very common. And then there's another perspective that says addiction is almost always an attachment disorder, and that it's a disconnection and isolation. So part of that third refuge, taking refuge in fellowship, sangha, community, is part of what's going to heal our attachment issues and allow us to reconnect with people and be of service and allow ourselves to be cared for, and the intimacy. Now, from there, from that commitment, then there's the work, right? So there's suffering, the cause of suffering, and the potential for recovery. And then there's the Eightfold Path that will lead to recovery. And that is understanding appropriately, seeing clearly reality, understanding that everything's impermanent, understanding that we're fully responsible for our own actions, how we're responding to what's happening in our life, understanding the importance of kindness and compassion and forgiveness, of understanding that the end of suffering is going to come when we've developed compassion towards pain, understanding that the end of suffering is going to come when we have non-attachment towards pleasure, when we break our addictive patterns. So understanding that abstinence from the substances or behaviors that got us into this in this first place necessary. We're an abstinence-based program. With that understanding, we followed up with wise intentions, the intention to be kind, to be compassionate, to be forgiving, to integrate mindfulness into every aspect of our life, these wise intentions. And then we go from there to communication and community. How do we show up? How do we communicate? Doing so in a wise and careful way. How do we affiliate with community? Showing up to meetings, showing up to be of service, to sanghas, satsangs, whatever you call them, right. But showing up and being part of community. Then there's the factor of action, which is a lot about renunciation. So we're in recovery, we've given up the drugs and the alcohol, we've established abstinence, but now we have to look at honesty and commit to truth-telling and commit to nonviolence, not causing harm to ourselves or others, and commit to being mindful and careful with our sexuality, and not setting sexuality aside from our spiritual practice, but saying, actually, my sexual desire is natural and my relationship to it is very important, and that there's a choice. Am I going to choose celibacy, or am I going to choose indulging in sexuality when it's appropriate? And what's the wise relationship to sexuality? A commitment, the minimum commitment is abstaining from sexual misconduct, any kind of behavior that's going to cause harm to ourselves or others. And then the fifth precept, which is abstaining from recreational drug and alcohol use, period. Now, this is a little bit controversial, because I'm saying, whether you're even if you don't have a substance abuse problem and a food is your addiction, or gambling, or money, or sex, I'm saying still, as the Buddha did, I'm supporting complete abstinence. If you want to use this mindfulness-based path, you can't put substances in your body that block mindfulness. So a drug-free lifestyle, which is supportive for us drug addicts who need to be abstinent, right. But it's challenging for some of the other addicts who say, hey, I can have a glass of wine. That doesn't block, but there's an encouragement in Refuge, as there is in all of Buddhism, for people who want to be awake to have total abstinence from recreational use of alcohol or drugs. Now, as we both know, most of our teachers don't follow that guideline.
This is true. Yep.
So I don't want to get too uptight about it because most of my teachers don't follow the fifth precept
Right.
in an abstinence form. But I have for 28 years, and it's supported my recovery.
Mm.
And I've seen lots of other Buddhists come and follow it and see what a support it is to say, I don't. That's not how I find my pleasure. I find my pleasure in other non-chemically induced experiences.
Yeah. Which
Yeah.
is great. Very important. I'm just thinking as you're talking about that. Last night, my wife and I were out for dinner, and it was our anniversary, so we went out, and um, I had ice cream for dessert. And I was thinking actually afterwards about something you wrote. I think it was in Against the Stream, your second book, about how ice cream can be pleasurable, but until we overindulge, and then it becomes we're sick, and it's not anymore. And I still at times watch the way my addiction works, recognizing that, of course, the drugs, alcohol, these things are all just symptoms, so they say, of this disease model. And after I had that ice cream, and this still, and it happens other times too, it's like, oh, well, fuck it. You had the ice cream. Why not eat more junk? And it's crazy to me how the mind still, years later, it still works like that. So it's, when people say, how long have you been sober and recovery? I get like the end of drugs and alcohol, but then I take that question and really look at it. It's like, well, I don't know. Yesterday I acted out completely with food and sugar, like, and I know I did, like, so it's an interesting thing to think about. But didn't drink yesterday, so there's that. So
And then there's levels of health,
yeah,
right? There's levels of health and levels of finding balance, and the humility of imperfection.
sure.
Of saying, I have these high ideals of abstinence and of always being compassionate and always being, and then there's the reality that I am not able to live up to those ideals, but
Right.
I'm constantly striving for that kind of balance.
Yeah, on a good day. That's very important. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to explore a little bit deeper with you is the two inventories, and how they differ from the other fellowships. Now I know in AA you go through the steps less rigorously, so to speak, than NA, which has tons of questions for each step. With
Right, right.
Refuge Recovery, I love that we have the first step inventory and the second step inventory. And you already talked a little bit about them, but can you explain a bit more about the difference? What do these questions explore? In my experience of working with them, it's the suffering, the craving, that aspect. But what for you? What's the difference, and what was the approach going into those specific questions?
Okay. I'm happy to jump into that, but I also am aware that I was talking about, I think I had made it to the fourth factor of
Oh,
the Eightfold Path, and I didn't get through the rest, so we can come back to it, or I could finish that
no, how
quickly.
about you finish that and then we'll dive into the
Okay.
questions. Yeah.
Because I was talking about the fourth factor of action,
Yes.
which includes abstinence and sexuality and honesty
Yes.
and nonviolence. And then the fifth factor, where we're actually looking at our relationship to money and work. As part of our recovery, traditionally in Buddhism, this is talked about the commitment to right livelihood and abstaining from earning money in a way that causes harm to ourselves or others. And this is a big one, I think, for a recovery program to take a stance on what people do for work,
Mm.
right? Like most recovery programs are like, well, that's your business. But because Buddhism is it's a life. It's like, how am I going to live in this world? There's nothing outside the realm. There's nothing outside of it, and so we're looking at livelihood and encouraging people if they're in what would be considered wrong livelihood. I had someone come up to me the other night at an event I was doing in San Francisco and saying, I'm all in for this thing, and I've been a butcher for 30 years. And I know that, part of what's being suggested here is to not be involved with killing animals or humans or anybody. He said, what should I do? He said, no, here's the other thing. He said, I'm vegan. he said,
Okay.
he said, I'm the vegan Buddhist butcher. But it's something that I got into a long time ago. I don't eat animals. He said, and I don't even kill them, but my job is to, carve up animals' bodies. That's what I do. So I didn't have a great answer for him, and but this is a big issue of saying, like, okay, you might be in what is traditionally considered not a great job, has something to do with killing or something, even like selling drugs, right? That's not so good. And in our culture, where if you work in a restaurant, you're selling the drug of alcohol. Right? And even if you work at Whole Foods, you're selling the drug of alcohol, right? So, we have the legal and illegal issues about but technically, from a Buddhist perspective, better to not be involved in anyone else's death or anyone else's intoxication. So, being patient with people and saying, find your own way with this. But we do want you to bring mindfulness to what you're doing for a living and your relationship to money. Not only what we're doing, but why we're doing it. And mindfulness of clinging, of fear, of, because money is such a central way that people suffer. And we were talking about sexuality before, but I think like money and sex, like often is about how people relapse. The fear of money, too much, kind of money, not knowing what to do with it, not having a wise relationship to it, end of a relationship. So really bringing sex and money in as a central part of our recovery. Whether you're a sex addict or a money addict, or, even if you're just a run-of-the-mill alcoholic, what's your relationship to money and sex? And let's get a healthy, wise, compassionate relationship to that very central part of our human experience. So from there, the next three are about meditation. The effort is the sixth factor, to be mindful and concentrated. Now, mindfulness doesn't come down until the seventh factor in the Eightfold Path, but all of what we're doing is mindfulness. Mindfulness is present time, non-judgmental, investigative, responsive awareness. So what's happening right now? How does it feel? And what's the wise response to what's happening and how it feels? And so that's a long-term developed practice and skill. But it's mindfulness of speech, mindfulness of relationship to sex, mindfulness of our relationship to money, mindfulness of what my intentions are. So all of it does come back to mindfulness, the seventh factor. And concentration is also important. Being able to focus the attention and sustain that focus mixed with mindfulness is what allows us to have insight into the impermanence. You get really focused, you're looking clearly at yourself or at any phenomena, and you see, everything's arising and passing and changing. And you start to see, this isn't so personal. This is just the human condition. This is just the mind. It's not who I am. And you start to see how unsatisfactory both pleasure are because of its impermanence and pain, and how if there's any clinging or aversion, we make it worse. We create suffering. So you have to have a fairly concentrated mind in order to see that clearly. So that's a brief overview of the Refuge Recovery program, right? The inventories, the taking refuge, and then these 8 aspects of our life that we're looking at. Now, people who are listening who aren't familiar with Buddhism or aren't familiar with this already, it's a little bit of a shift in paradigm to go from like 12-step perspective that says it's linear, right? Do the first step, do the second step, do the third, kind of linear. Buddhism's not so linear. The way that I've created is I do want people to do the first step inventory, which we're going to discuss in more detail. I want people to do the second step inventory. And then I want them to dive into and at the same time dive into mindfulness and forgiveness and compassion meditation. Mm-hmm. But we have to look at the Eightfold Path not as steps, but as a wheel. So that this is a wheel with 8 spokes on it. And there's the spoke of mindfulness that supports all of the other spokes. And there's the spoke of understanding that supports all of the other spokes. And then all of the 8 spokes are what allow our wheel to be true, as they say, right? Well tuned and to roll without wobbles.
Right.
And so it's simultaneously developing these 8 factors rather than one at a time.
Right. Yeah, and I very much appreciate that, the interrelatedness of all of it. It is. I see how it, like you said, can be counterintuitive to those who have that more 12-step AANA whatever background. But I don't know. As I've dived into the material, like I said, over the last couple of years, I've found it's really brought me deeper. And this is not to take anything away from those fellowships, because they have served me very well and continue to, because I will at times still go to those meetings, and they're great people. I agreed some of the words and language used and the way they approach it doesn't resonate with me so much anymore. But so anyways, I do love this integrated approach you take. So that said, let's go back into now the two inventories and the approach, how it differs in the Refuge Recovery model versus the more traditional 12-step models.
Well, the fourth step, although you're more familiar with the NA's approach to the workbook. I mean, I actually went through the NA workbook once, but it was like 20 something years ago, and I don't really remember it that well. The fourth step in AA is pretty simple. It's, what are your resentments, and what was the cause, and what was your part, and how did it affect your life? These four columns. Now, in Refuge Recovery, that's one of the 27 questions. What is your resentments, and what was your part, and how did it affect your life? So then, and it goes so far beyond that, of really looking at how are all of the ways that you've suffered? How did craving, how did clinging, how did your self-esteem, how did all of these things affect you and affect your addiction? Where was there trauma? Where was there abandonment, neglect, abuse? Even in the first question of the second truth inventory is, what's your most painful memory? And how did that memory, how was it affected by your addiction? And how did it affect your addiction? And so really turning towards the suffering and the pain of our history and acknowledging, I was drinking about this pain. I was using about it. And, and it became more painful rather than being a solution in the long run. So my sense is that all of the inventory, like 10th step, 11th step, and 4th step inventories that exist in the 12 steps are covered in the Refuge Recovery model, but then it's, 10 times as thorough. It's asking you for 10 times as more deeper kind of looking into the different areas and aspects of your heart and your mind and your life, not just at resentments.
Right. So something that obviously is absent from these inventories, as well as the Refuge Recovery book itself, is the God stuff. And, we had an interesting conversation a couple of weeks ago where you made a point, something I'd never really thought about, where in regards to relapse, you were saying that some people, not all, but some people may have relapsed as a result of their dependence on God or their relationship to God, or that faltering, they're being told one thing in this program and then it doesn't come to fruition and they feel abandoned. And anyways, I would love to chat a little bit more about that with you. For obviously, because that was a conversation people won't have access to, but so let's talk a bit about that. What if you could revisit that? I was really fascinated by that.
Right. Well, I feel I'm willing, but I also feel a little bit hesitant because my sense is I am a Buddhist atheist.
Sure.
Like that's just sort of my 30 years of practice and investigation and 12 step and Hindu and Sufi and all of the stuff that I've practiced. I landed in a really non-theistic view.
Maybe just to help offset this, I
Yeah.
still do believe in God, not in the traditional sense of God. So that's why I found it very interesting, and I didn't disagree with anything you said. So maybe that will just help, keep the balance here, because even though I have a deep reverence and I practice Buddhism, I still do have a uh, a respect and a belief in not the traditional God in the sky, but a God of my understanding, as they would say in the 12 steps.
Yeah.
So
And you feel comfortable with that language.
completely, it
So,
doesn't
so,
conflict at all for me. Yeah.
right. So a couple of things that I want to say is that in Refuge, we're finding, people that are really atheist are like, okay, finally, I don't have to, that language isn't here, and they appreciate that. People who are a bit agnostic, or people, I think that probably 70% of the people that are doing refuge recovery are in your camp, where they like the 12 steps, good enough. But they also, was a missing piece for them, and they appreciate this Buddhist perspective. Um, and then I'm also finding people who are totally and completely theistic, love the 12 steps, but they never got really taught how to meditate. And so they're enjoying that about refuge. So I don't want to present refuge recovery as like you have to be an atheist.
Right.
The truth is that's my truth, right? But it's not the truth of a lot of people in the rooms. A lot of people are much more integrating 12 steps and refuge, and but it fits for both the theist, the non-theist, the atheist,
Right.
and the kind of questioning agnostics.
Right.
So I think that that's important. Referring to that question, that conversation that we had in the past, where we were discussing relapse, and I said, yeah, I think that sometimes people are told, God is going to remove your shortcomings. You are powerless. Only God can remove your alcoholism or your drug addiction. Only a higher power can do that. God could and would if he were sought, and it's so much of this. It's not you. You don't have the power to do it. It's only by the grace of God. I was visiting a treatment center in Texas last year, and they said, we here at this treatment center believe that the clients cannot choose whether they stay sober or they don't. That they have, that all drug addicts, all alcoholics have zero choice whether or not they pick up. Only God chooses whether you relapse or not. And that's not an uncommon perspective.
Sure.
When you start talking about powerlessness, and you start talking about God's will. So my sense is that sometimes people say, okay, I tried that. I pray. I did the 3rd step prayer. I did the 7th step prayer, and I kept relapsing. I turned my will and my life over to God, and then I relapsed over and over. I think that sometimes people get disillusioned, and they say, I tried to believe that, and it didn't keep me sober. And now I'm coming to Refuge, who's saying, it's your responsibility. It's through your own actions, through your own efforts, that you can learn to be uncomfortable and not drink about it. And that discomfort's not going to magically be removed from you. And it's going to take a gradual process to learn compassion for your pain, but that you're actually going to take full responsibility for your behaviors and your actions, and not that it's going to be removed by some sort of grace. Right. Or divine intervention.
Well said. And I wanted to bring that up because I didn't disagree at all with what you said. I thought it was a very fascinating point. And like I said, one that I had never really considered. And I think it is important for some people to take a look at that. One of the very popular sentiments in the 12-step traditions is fake it till you make it. And I'm not anti that. I see the benefit, especially for those who are just literally crawling in, from a horrible run, or, they've been out there for years. So I get that. But to a certain extent, I think it's also important to keep an eye on that, especially when it comes to the higher power issue, because for some people, they will find it and it will work for them, and that's great. For others, they won't, and I think they will have the experience you just mentioned, yet there's continuing on with that fake it till you make it, fake it till you make it. And if that's not their real truth, then they're going to fake it into the grave, some of them perhaps, so I really appreciated that perspective, that you shared. So,
Well, and there's this assigning of what I see as assigning of meaning where if you stay sober, it wasn't you, it was God.
Sure.
If you don't stay sober, it was self will. Right? It was you. Anything bad that happens is your fault. Anything good that happens, it was God. It wasn't you.
Yeah.
And so it's just this sort of disempowering rather than taking responsibility. Now, it works for a lot of people in the belief that a loving, caring, higher power is going to help you. It's a very wonderful, comforting philosophy. And I don't need to take that away from anyone.
Sure.
People, believe what they believe. But if you don't, if that doesn't make sense to you, refuge is a refuge for all of us that kind of said, "Oh, that never really made a lot of sense to me."
Yes, exactly. Very well said.
I
And
I don't know what you think, but I think that like half of the people in the 12 steps that are using the higher power language actually don't believe in God at all.
no, many of them don't.
Just using that language because they have to, because that's the norm in that scene.
It's what they know. One of the greatest struggles for me when I did a substance abuse counseling internship, when I would work with the new clients who would come in, more than half of them, their biggest problem was with the God word. They had whatever stuff they had shoved down their throats as kids or whatever horrible experiences, and they want to recover and they want to do this or that, but they couldn't, that was their excuse not to like give the 12 steps a shot. Now that's not to say that others finally went and did find, it useful. But even in my case, someone who, like I said, I don't have an issue with that word. I see how it's loaded. I totally understand it. Doesn't bother me so much, but, because I can just get around it. But coming to refuge, I just see how it goes a bit deeper for me in my life. I always say when people ask, what's the path, this or that, I'm not going to advocate one over another. What I advocate is what works for you. So
Yeah.
if that is refuge, ride that train all the way home. If you find it in NA or A, go for it, but I do love refuge in that regard. And my refuge mentor who runs the Bolton meeting in Connecticut, we can talk about God, but he is very much Buddhist and he runs it the format as it is, and it's a great meeting. And like you said, there have people come in. He often tells me about the new people that come in. They believe in God, they don't, that whatever. He just loves telling me about them, and just the diverse crowd of people that show up at those meetings and find it very, very beneficial. So
I don't know if I said this already. One of the things that we're finding that I didn't realize was going to happen was that we're getting people that are really 12 step averse. They've been there, they don't want to hear it.
right.
And then they start coming to refuge for a little while and they get a taste of community, of sangha,
Yeah.
of fellowship. And they get a taste of, okay, now I have a philosophy and a perspective for myself. And then they find I can go to NA. I can go to AA. Now that I've gotten, so like refuge is actually a bridge to the 12-step programs for some people where, now I can do both. Before I just couldn't go there. All I heard was God, God, God. Now that I have refuge, I have a path and a practice and a treatment modality, and I can go there and fellowship. And, I can translate it and I can find my own way with that theistic language now that I have a non-theistic approach to my own recovery.
Right.
Right.
That's incredible. You haven't mentioned that to me, but it makes sense. I see how it works. I wish, this was around when I was doing that internship, because what a pain in the ass that is to work with. But that's what I love. And I see now that, the meetings are just popping up continually in Connecticut. I live in Canada now. There's not one in Ottawa. I'm waiting. I would start it if I wasn't on the road half the time myself, but hopefully it'll be here soon. But in Connecticut, where I live in the U.S., there's 4 meetings now in that little last state. There's 4 refuge recovery meetings, and there's one in pretty much almost every state now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm thinking that there's somewhere between 150 and 200 meetings at
That's
this
amazing.
point, and it feels pretty good for 2 years in. The book's only been out for 2 years. We're having our second annual Refuge Recovery Conference this summer in June in Los Angeles. So it feels like it's growing, and I don't know if it's every state or not. I was looking at Dave Smith, who's running the nonprofit and the website for Refuge. We're creating a map thing for the website where you can kind of click on your state or your country, and it'll tell you what meetings are there. But we don't have it up and running yet
Right.
to see if it's. I don't think it's every state yet. I don't think it's 52 or whatever.
It's a
It's
lot. I had looked a while ago and then also seeing it's in some other countries. Like I know Toronto, maybe Montreal. There's a few places in Canada. There's a few places,
yeah.
I don't know, across the sea there. So that's great. And you also have
Yeah,
oh, go ahead, sir.
there's a few in Europe and there's a few in Mexico
Mexico.
and Central America, but yeah.
That's really cool. And there's a treatment center, or at least one, or that's the one thing I wasn't clear on. What?
Yeah, just one treatment center here in Los Angeles where I live, and we opened a detox, residential, outpatient, sober living, the whole thing. I just really felt like if I was going to put this perspective out to the world, saying you can use this as your primary recovery tool,
Yeah.
that people are going to be going to treatment centers and saying I want to do refuge recovery, and the treatment centers aren't going to know how to do it.
Right.
So I felt like it was responsible for us to say we'll offer a full, from detox all the way through extended care treatment. And so we've been doing that for about 2 years here in LA.
That's incredible. So moving forward, what's your vision for refuge recovery? I think it probably goes without saying you'd like to see more treatment centers, more meetings. Is there a grand vision you have for it, or the collective has for it?
Not. I don't have a specific. More, just I want to support it. I want to let it be pretty organic, like let it unfold in whatever ways it will unfold. I'm sort of as curious as anyone else to see where will it be in 10 years or 20 years. I have committed, like you said in the beginning, I've got a lot going on. I've got 2 other nonprofit organizations, and I'm quite busy. But I've committed a good chunk of my time and energy to supporting refuge recovery, and whether it's the meetings or the treatment center. And so far, we are just in LA, and at some point, it would be nice to have treatment centers in other places. So I'd like to see that happen, but I don't have a timeline or a clear agenda with it, other than I'm here to support it and to help facilitate it in its own sort of time.
Yeah, very cool,
Yeah.
man. So last thing, moving maybe slightly away from refuge recovery, what are you working on now? Is there any new books down the pipeline, or what are you? I mean, like we said many times, you're a busy man, but what's
Yeah.
happening in Noah Levine's world?
Just what we're talking about now. I haven't started a new manuscript, and it's kind of actually really nice to not be working on a book. I mean, I did 4 books in, I guess it was, 15 years or whatever. But it just felt like I always had a book that I was writing, and I had a passion for each one of those books. Currently, my passion is refuge recovery. Refuge recovery does need some more literature. We are doing pamphlets for the meetings. We need to develop traditions for refuge recovery that we don't really have yet. And so that's happening. That's part of what we do at this annual conference. There needs to be like a 12 by 12 basically for refuge, maybe a workbook. So I'll probably put some energy into that, but I'm going to stick with refuge recovery right now.
Good.
There is a book sort of brewing back here that I want to write at some point. And that's like an American Buddhism book. A book that says, we're not Tibetan, we're not Japanese, we're not Thai or Burmese. Some of us might be, but that our tradition isn't, trying to reproduce the Asian tradition, but that we're actually taking a stand in this firmly rooted Western Buddhism. And so at some point I want to do that. I just don't have the energy for it right now. And then also when I think about doing it, I was like, well, what's the difference between that book and Against the Stream? Like I kind of already wrote that book.
That's a good call. Yeah.
Although I do have a good title for it.
Oh, you do? Can you share it with us, or is it under wraps?
But just something like around American Buddhism.
Okay,
And
that's
kind of
cool. Yeah.
clear. Yeah. But even that, it's like North American Buddhism. And then all of my friends in Europe are going to be pissed and say, hey, you can't call this shit American Buddhism. It has to be, but Western Buddhism just doesn't have quite the right ring to it.
Yeah.
So that, and then with my father dying this year, I had a little bit of a motivation, although I'm not sure that I'll do it, to maybe write a little bit of memoir stuff about my relationship with him. Some people have asked me, like, okay, Dharma Pumps was 15 years ago. That book ends in 2000. What about writing a bit of a memoir about the last 15 years. Uh, I feel like there's an interesting book there with my divorce this year, my father dying. There's an interesting where, 15 years later, 28 years into recovery and Dharma practice, how did this year unfold? So I think that that would be a sort of interesting memoir type book.
Right. Plus, you were
Uh,
back in India.
yeah, and then I was back in India doing the 20-year reunion of so some ideas, but I don't know at the moment if I actually want to sit down and do any writing.
Yeah, I hear
Yeah.
you. Well, thanks for sharing about that. It's great though that your energy is going into refuge recovery. It's really really taking off. It's awesome to watch it just flourishing. So, um, you know, deep bows to you for that work for sure. And before we wrap up, is there anything that I didn't ask regarding refuge, or anything else that you'd like to share before we bring this conversation to a close?
I mean, I don't think so, and I know that people will find us, againstthestream.org,
Yep.
refugerecovery.com. If people need treatment, and this interests them, consider us. If there's not a meeting in your town, start one. You don't need to be trained. It's peer led. I think in the book it talks about like if you have 6 months sobriety, maybe it's a year, to start a meeting, and then we'll put it on the website, and people will start showing up. Um, just kind of an open, happy to let people that watch your show know about it, but also like support this if it resonates. Like, don't wait. I know for you, you're too busy, but for other people, don't wait for someone else to start a meeting. Start one. Like, get it going. You can be of service to that community in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll have the links up also on this page, and so people can just simply click on it. I encourage everyone to check it out. Check out the book. Even like you said, if it's not drugs or alcohol, it's applicable for anything, man. Food, sex, shopping. It's all relevant with refuge recovery. I can't encourage people enough to read the book, as well as know your other books. They've been very helpful in my life and many others I know. So thank you for that, and thank you
My
again
pleasure.
for your time. It's always great to catch up with you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, man.